stage as opposed to 5. Unfortunately, Elizabeth Gilbert was unable to join the festival this year. And Sarah Waters is not feeling well, so she has had to cancel. However, the authors here have promised to be twice as interesting to make up for it. This session is proudly presented by Dainik Bhaskar. Beautiful Offspring, the art of historical fiction. Please join me in welcoming Damon Galgut, Eleanor Catton, and Kamila Shamsie.
Wait for the mic. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah. No? Everyone can't hear me all right? Okay. Yeah? Is this any better? No, still not better? I have to keep on talking until the volume reaches a level where those in the back are going to raise their hands and tell me it's fine. Yes? Excellent. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Welcome to this session. As you heard, we are reduced in numbers, and Sarah Waters in particular said to pass on her apologies. She was looking forward to this session and being in this conversation, but as we know, sometimes it happens when people come to India. They are felled by some disease or the other. But it's my very great pleasure to be here in conversation with Damon Galgut and Eleanor Catton, who are both fantastic writers, and it just means we can have more expansive answers than previously. They are both highly celebrated writers. They're also really wonderful writers. The two often overlap, but not always exactly. Damon also has the distinction of possibly being the only person at this festival who can make Eleanor look like she got off to a late start. Damon's first novel was published when he was 17. He's written 8 works of prose fiction, 2 of which were shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize and also for the Impact. I think The Good Doctor was shortlisted for the Good Doctor, the Impact Prize. Eleanor Catton's first novel, The Rehearsal, was shortlisted and won a brace of prizes around the world. And her second, of course, The Luminaries, won the Man Booker Prize. So we're in very great company here. We're here to discuss the art of historical fiction. And before I start off asking questions generally to both, I want to ask a specific question to each of them. Eleanor, in your case, your novel in many ways takes on the form of the 19th century novel and then plays with it in various ways. What is the draw of the 19th century novel to someone writing in the 21st century?
Well, I think for me personally, can you hear me all right? Oh, shall I keep talking until I get away?
You have to keep talking.
I think that's the... is this all right now? Or should I lift it up? Is this better? For me personally, the 19th century is just so exciting in terms of the developments that happened in the novel at that time. I really revere the century as a whole as a century of just such experimentation and such difference in terms of what the novel was capable of. And when I decided to start writing The Luminaries, had settled upon the gold rush, one of New Zealand's gold rushes as my subject, taking place in the late 1860s in New Zealand. I started thinking about the project of writing about the past and writing into the past, and decided that it was very important to see if I could write a novel that was plausibly of the 19th century as well as set in the 19th century, where the values of the age were communicated in ways that kind of went beyond the individual experience of the characters. that went into, for example, the diction and the style of the prose, the stately kind of slowness with which the story unfolded, and also the formal experimentation, which I think, you know, was a big part of the novel in the 19th century. I'm continually floored to think that Moby Dick was a novel that was published when it was. You know, it seems like if it were published today, it would be incredibly, astonishingly modern. And so, you know, the project of that began with just reading as much 19th century fiction as I could, and really taking notes from everything that I read. You know, I underlined nearly half of the Brothers Karamazov, for example. Wrote out in my own words the sentences of Henry James. If I came upon a particular sentence structure or an idiom that I really liked, but it struck me as something that was unfamiliar to our time, I would write it out, put it into my computer, and go and return to it as much as possible, kind of in order to take on the language of the century and absorb it in some way.
Yeah. I have to tell you, since you mentioned Moby Dick, I was in Antarctica last month, and I was reading Moby Dick, and there was a young Australian man on the ship as well, and I said, well, I'm reading Moby Dick, which is probably the best book you could be reading on a ship in Antarctica, and he said, well, I'm reading The Luminaries, and that's pretty fantastic as well. So you are read in Antarctica as well as everywhere else. Okay, so here's a question which is going to reveal a depth of ignorance. We know about the 19th century novel in England and in America. Was there is there the 19th century novel of New Zealand, or did you have to invent it?
Well, that was actually one of the great pleasures of writing The Luminaries for me, that, you know, New Zealand has a very young literary history. Yeah. The treaty between the British and the native peoples was signed in 1840. And so by the time, you know, something like Moby Dick was being published, New Zealand was only, by colonial standards, you know, about 30 or 40 years old. And so one of the great pleasures that I had was, in effect, writing New Zealand into that tradition, going to the novels of the Northern Hemisphere, and figuring out what I loved about them, but also having fun inverting those traditions in a lot of ways to make sense for the Southern Hemisphere context. It's a very interesting thing in New Zealand that our literary history really begins with modernism, that Catherine Mansfield is really the first New Zealand-born author to make a splash on the world stage. But it's a very funny thing to think of a literary tradition beginning with modernism, because if you begin with modernism, you kind of, what the modernism is reacting to is very strange and curious. Yeah. So the project of writing New Zealand into the 19th century was just enormous fun. But I also was very conscious in writing that I don't share 19th century values, thank goodness. And a lot of the values that the 19th century novel tends to espouse, particularly in terms of empire, in terms of its attitudes towards race and towards class and towards gender, I absolutely didn't want to reproduce in my own work. So it's this kind of quite tricky tightrope, I suppose, you have to walk in terms of taking on a form, taking on the sights and smells and sounds of another century, but also staying true to your own values, which I think is also very important. And very often, historical fiction, I think, when it's done poorly, can corrupt either the values of the past by misunderstanding them, or can corrupt the author's own values by indulging a kind of exploitation or prurience, I think, in terms of, replicating instances or experience in the past that we see as being inhumane now.
Yeah. Damon, let me turn to you. So Arctic Summer is a novel of E.M. Forster in India. I mean, it's really that period of Forster's life that is the center of, or his relationship with India and Ross Massoud. And I'm sure people here would particularly want to know, what was there about E.M. Forster in India that was a draw for you in terms of where you wanted to set your novelistic imagination?
I think I'm a little bit of a fraud on this panel in the sense that actually I have no special interest in historical fiction per se. I never thought I'd write anything in that genre.
Yeah.
And I was somewhat surprised when I was drawn to the subject, but it's not the history that interests me. The history really is a means to something far more personal. I mean, what interested me is, if you like, the contemporary aspects, or what I relate to in a contemporary way about Forster's story. I've been visiting India for the past 15 years. This is my 13th visit here, and cumulatively over the years, I've probably spent 6 years of my life here.
And your previous book, In the Strange Room, was also partly
yes,
set
although
in India.
Yes, although that's far more of an obviously contemporary piece of work. I've been looking for a while to find a subject that could express what it is that goes into the writing of a novel. And I found it in Forster's long struggle to get A Passage to India written. It took him 11 years. He was stuck for 9 years. All of that, although it's historically, factually based, resonates with me as a writer. I wanted to express something of my own struggle with writing. I spend a lot of time being blocked, far more time being blocked than actually actively working. I wanted to reflect my own interest in India and how that could be translated into fiction. Various other aspects of Forster's life resonate with my own. So I guess the attraction of writing this was that you could write about somebody who was very far removed from you in time and place, and yet in a covert sort of way be writing about yourself.
Yeah. I mean, one of the wonderful things in that novel is that there's so many sort of tensions and nuances. You've got class, sexuality, empire, all those things going on. So it's very rich space. But one of the things that also occurred to me as I was reading it, because part of it is, Ross Massoud very early on says to Forster, you must come to India and write a novel about it. And Forster doesn't know whether he can, whether that's his subject. And I do wonder sometimes about, you said you feel like a fraud in this panel. And I've sometimes, when I've had the term historical fiction put on my work, I sort of thought, is it? I don't know. I mean, it's set in 1915. Does that make it historical fiction? But Forster's questions about whether and how to write about a place he doesn't know made me wonder if actually the separation isn't between writers writing the near, their present, and writers writing the past, but whether it's between writers who always write the familiar and those who go towards the unfamiliar as well. Because when you're writing about the past, that's really what it is. It has to be the unfamiliar, even if you know it. And I wonder whether you could talk a little about writing the things you know, as opposed to, because you both, Eleanor, your first book was not set in the 19th century. It was a more, so I imagine there was less of a kind of research for it. So in terms of writing the familiar versus writing the unfamiliar, are these very distinct processes? What are their particular delights and challenges either way?
Well, I've always really loved Stephen King's separation of the art of writing fiction into three very discrete skills or aspects, which is the aspect of narration, of description, and of dialogue. These being three very different skills to learn that each require quite a different skill from the writer, I suppose. And I think that with historical fiction or anything that is unfamiliar, so that would also include actually speculative fiction and fantasy, things that are projections into another kind of unfamiliar world. The job of narration and the job of description become very closely aligned.
Right.
Because not only do you have to propel your characters through your story and kind of make it interesting and make time pass, but you also have to paint the world, you have to describe the world in a way that is visual and scenic for the reader. So I think that, if I was writing a contemporary novel, I would never describe in detail how somebody opens a web browser and types something into a Google search field, and I would never describe the way in which the letters are laid out on the keyboard of a laptop, or the sound it makes when it gets turned on, because I would expect that all of my readers would know, you know, as I do.
You're not thinking about the fact that they will be reading you in another 80 years and wondering what that's all
right,
about.
Yeah. But I think that you always have to write for the readers that you have, which are the contemporary readers. Right. And so what that does mean is that, you know, going back to the 19th century, how to load a musket, for example, is something I would describe in detail, because I wouldn't expect that my readers would know how to do that. I read a very funny blog a wee while ago, which is about kind of cardinal sins that writers of historical fiction commit. And one of the things that was on this list was any description of clothing that runs for more than half a page, which I thought was very funny. But I think that in a way, this, you know, to go back to this fusion of description and narration, I can think of an exception to that rule, that where a description of clothing running to have more than half a page would be appropriate. And I think that would be in a context where you wanted to convey a kind of vanity or opulence or sumptuousness on the part of the character, where the narrative demanded that kind of description. But it's quite hard to know sometimes what the level of familiarity on the reader's part is going to be with your material. And I think that, you know, assuming their unfamiliarity can be very patronizing, you know, because, you know, if I was to say, you know, write a novel about the Second World War and kind of explain in detail who won the war, that would be patronizing of my reader's intelligence. So it's a hard thing to navigate. But I think probably in my writing experience with this book, I was thinking more about the reader's familiarity and unfamiliarity more than my own, I think.
Damon, familiar versus the unfamiliar?
Well, to relate it to Forster for a moment, I mean, Forster's early novels, which were written in a kind of concentrated flurry right at the beginning of his career, are in sharp contrast to Passage to India. They were covering subjects that he knew. I mean, frequently, you know, English people in England or English people in Italy specifically. Right. Part of the struggle that he had with the writing of the book is that he was venturing, you know, to the other side of the world and into a whole culture and civilization that he didn't know, or that he had to come to know. And it may not be unrelated to the fact that it was his last novel, even though he lived for another 50 years. He never published another novel. I think he kind of exhausted something in himself, and the exhaustion maybe came from having to come to terms with something that was, you know, so big and so foreign. I mean, if I may use an example from another book, although it's not an historical novel, another novel of mine, The Good Doctor, is narrated by a doctor. Now, I'm not a doctor. I don't know anything about how medicine works. And in early drafts of that book, it felt to me that I had to make it authentic by researching a lot of, you know, medical detail and putting those medical details into the narrative. And actually, it just didn't work. Yeah. And it occurred to me at a certain point, a very simple and obvious solution is that you only relate those facts that are directly relevant in whatever moment you're describing. So in fact, the solution to making, you know, doctorhood convincing was was actually to make it minimal. So once I sort of arrived at that, it became far easier, and you know, it's kind of gratifying to me to go to writers' festivals and occasionally have people say to me, so, you know, how is your medical career going now? So, well, I actually don't have one. But, you know, for me, and perhaps Eleanor's approach is different, with writing this, I've tried to work with the historical details in the same way. You assume that human beings are the same, that we're all on a kind of emotional human continuum, and that, you know, the physical, technological details of life change, but you need only really negotiate those details that are directly relevant at any given moment.
But let's talk a bit about details and getting them right. I once read an interview with Ian McEwan, and I think I'm not misremembering this, it would be fantastic if I were, but someone wrote to him, a reader, and said in one of your novels, there's a moment when the character looks up at the sky and sees a particular star or constellation, but given the location of your character and the time of year, that constellation would not have been visible. And McEwan said he read this and he felt appalled and made sure that for the next edition, his publishers would correct that. And I have to say, as I read this, I thought, that is so OCD, and then I thought I would do exactly the same thing because I get, unnecessarily, I think, caught up in getting where there's a fact, in making sure I get it right. And I know that writers of fiction have very different approaches to it, and some will say, actually, if for the purposes of narrative, I can elide a few facts or a few years and smudge details, then that's fine because the readers know it's a work of fiction. So I wondered what your approaches were to, of course, constellations are important in your book. They're deliberately wrong sometimes, but what would you change the constellation if someone pointed out it was in the wrong place?
Well, actually, I've had a great many very similar experiences to that. The Luminaries is just riddled with historical errors, some of which I was aware of and some of which I was not at the time of publication. One of them is that a character in the book was born in Oslo. It's kind of an interesting instance, actually, of what you're describing. A reader wrote in to my publisher to say that for a very brief period in the 19th century, the city of Oslo was called Christiania. It was for about maybe 30 or 40 years or something. And so, therefore, this was historically inaccurate. So it's kind of an interesting case because we then changed, in the subsequent editions, we changed the word Oslo to Christiania. And then we had the problem of everybody saying, well, where's Christiania? We have no idea what the city is. Right. So again, it's a case of the reader's familiarity with the details that you're describing. I think that sometimes if you're too faithful to how it was, you end up missing a connection with the real live people who are going to be reading your book.
Right.
But my process in terms of kind of mining that detail or accessing that detail in the first place was actually to read the newspapers of the 19th century. The National Library of New Zealand has the most incredible archive that's recently been put all online, where you can choose any part of New Zealand, any region, scroll down a list of newspapers that were published, choose a date, and literally just print out the newspaper, put up your heels and start reading it. And I found in the newspapers all sorts of details that it was very, very difficult to find elsewhere. Things like how much a night's sleep would cost in this town at this time, or the brands of certain types of wax and soap, and all these kinds of physical details. And so, I found that very helpful, actually, because I did read a few books of 19th century history just to kind of orient myself in terms of world events to make sure I wasn't putting the wrong person on the throne or, what have you. But I found that the works of history tended to be very, they tended to have a kind of a global perspective, a wide-angle perspective that was not very useful to me. I was more interested in the experiential details, which were actually quite hard to find.
Yeah, I think I drove my publisher demented in the run-up to publication because we'd sort of arrived at what was supposed to be a final manuscript, and I kept discovering things or thinking of things, and very often it's embedded in language as opposed to historical detail. An example I can think of is I'd been quite, you tend as a writer to reach naturally for the vocabulary that you use in your own life, and of course words change and their meanings change. I'd been quite liberal with the use of the word culture in the book, and it suddenly occurred to me at a very late stage that maybe that's a word that would not have been used in Forster's time, and indeed it proved to be so. The word that would have been used, and it probably approximates our meaning, is worldview. So I had to change that. And, there were any number of those kinds of examples, which doesn't mean that you arrive at a perfect product. There are always readers out there who fasten on those particular details. And, it's exactly like Eleanor, you feel if you get one of those details wrong, somehow the universe that you've created is untruthful in some way. So, yeah, it's a kind of ongoing and perpetual torment. But, this can apply to contemporary novels too. In an earlier book, I was describing a divorce which I unthinkingly said took place in the Supreme Court in South Africa. My mother, who's been through a divorce, pointed out to me, actually, it would have happened in the magistrate's court. So that particular universe got invalidated too with that misstep.
Well, since you're mentioning language, would you read a bit from the novel and perhaps talk about sort of choices or decisions you made in terms of particularly a dialogue of a different time period about whether you're going to go into sort of the vernacular or sort of slang in a big way, or how you had to think through the language you would be using?
Well, you know, when I'm writing, I usually try to avoid reading other writers who have a very strong style, because it can, you know, it can throw your own off beat. Whereas with the writing of this book, I read as much Forster and as much of the writing that was published in Forster's time as I could, because I wanted that language to seep in. And actually that was, for me, a very effective way to feel the rhythm of the language, the kind of, the sort of formal tone that it might have, which we don't have now. I'm going to read a piece that describes Forster's first meeting with a Greek poet, Constantine Cavafy, which took place in Alexandria in Egypt during the First World War, where Forster stayed for 3 years. It's perhaps not widely known that Cavafy was brought to the attention of the West through Forster, in fact. Part of the pleasure of writing this book was in taking what we know to be an established fact, such as the fact that Forster met Cavafy and liked his poetry, and then giving body to that. I mean, it's one thing to know that something happened, it's quite another thing to inhabit what might have taken place and how these two men might have spoken to each other. So that's the sort of area where the novelistic imagination sort of takes off. Morgan is Forster's first name, and it's how I refer to him through the book. Morgan had heard many stories about the poet by now, little flashes and fragments from different sources. In the miniature world of Alexandrian cultural life, Cavafy was famous, which was to say people talked about him, sometimes admiringly, sometimes in low-voiced asides. It was well known that he came from a good family, originally from Constantinople, which had lost its fortune through bad luck and worse investments. One by one, the various progeny had floated away or died, leaving the youngest son, now middle-aged and alone, among the lingering leftover debris of their lives. And there were other little anecdotes about the shadowy corners of his life, which stirred envy and disgust in different quarters. The night was cool. Cavafy had a half cigarette in his holder, unlit, and he was waving it about as he talked in a long-suffering tone about his employment in the Ministry of Public Works. His department was the third circle of irrigation, and he was pained by the stupidity of his colleagues. "I have to check their grammar," he told Morgan, "in every memorandum, every letter, and no matter how many times I explain the correct use of the comma, they simply repeat their mistakes. And let us say nothing of the apostrophe. But I do not give up. I call them in and explain it all again in the hope that one day the light may dawn. What a happy day that would be. But I doubt it will ever come. There's no atom of poetry in any of them, not one." The mention of poetry seemed to trouble him. He reflected for a long moment, then looked mournfully at Morgan through his spectacles. "You have not asked to read my poems," he said. "I haven't presumed, but I very much want to read them. They will all be Greek to you precisely because they're written in that language. But more than that," he gave a shrug that was half a sigh. "My concerns are not those of most people. I'm an unusual man. I'm drawn to the past, you see, the very old past, or else to the margins of current life. I am, oh, what is the use?" His eyes had left Morgan and were roaming beyond the corners of the room. Morgan said again, "I very much want to read them." "You could never understand my poetry, my dear Forster, never." "Perhaps I might. You should try it on me at least." "No, no, no, what is the use? This seemed to be final, but he abruptly stood up. "Please wait," he said. "I'm going to the bindery." And he disappeared into a back room. When he reappeared soon afterwards, it was with a loose leaf folder under his arm in which Morgan could see pages handwritten in red and black ink. But the poet didn't return to his chair. "Let us move to the red salon. The light is much better there." The light was not better in the red salon. It was the room itself, the furnishings that were of higher quality. There was no oil lamp here, only candles, which Kavafi began to move about in accordance with some private design. He finally appeared satisfied when he'd enshrouded himself in shadow, and Morgan was near the window with a fitful yellow glow to read by. The visitor was aware of being tested. Kavafi had become bored and indifferent, which could only mean he cared deeply. But Morgan's Greek, unexercised since his days at Cambridge, didn't feel up to the task. He was imperfectly aware of the meanings he held in his hand, and after a few frowning, peering minutes, could offer a mere paltry observation. There are some coincidences, perhaps, it seems to me, between this Greek and public school Greek. I might be wrong. The effect was instantaneous. Kavafi snapped upright in his chair, alert and awake in a moment. "Oh, but this is good, my dear Foster, very good indeed." He began to call fretfully for his servant. "Magani, come here immediately, Magani." Magani came and was told by his master to bring whiskey. "My glass is not yet empty," Morgan said. "Yes, but that is the Palamas whiskey. Poetry requires something better. In the red glasses, Magani." Magani brought good whiskey in red glasses, as well as a plate of cheese and olives. Candles were being snuffed out and others lit in a fresh configuration. It was Kavafi now who was visible, and his guest who had sunk into shadow. The poems, too, had changed hands. Morgan understood that his station had altered now that he'd proved worthy. The red salon, the red glasses, they signified an uptick in esteem. He tried to disport himself accordingly. But in a moment, when the poet began to read, there was no need to pretend. Kavafi's voice, with its cultivated English accent, was soft and certain. He was translating as he went, but it was clear that he knew his own words very well, and the paper was almost unnecessary. The long, pale face, with its saurian eyelids, its air of melancholic delicacy, seemed to vanish in a moment into a mist through which Morgan was led down a winding passage that took him to an image of a midnight procession, ghostly but beautiful, passing out of the Alexandrian city gates in a time long ago that might have been no time at all. I'm going to leave it there, but I'd like to make a comment that that description of the poem and the way it took Foster's mind back to another time is what I think one is trying to do in writing this kind of fiction. You want the words to fall away and the picture to come to life. Something else, a phrase that I used here, this is one that some pernickety reader picked up on. The red salon, the red glasses, they signified an uptick in esteem. Somebody very, very triumphantly pointed out to me that the word uptick would not have belonged in that time, and unfortunately is correct. It's something I have to change in future editions if there are any. Thank you.
And Eleanor, would you read a bit as well and talk to us about finding the voice or the language of the piece?
Yes, I absolutely agree with that last comment. I think that some of the best tools that you have as a describer when you're writing something set in the past or set in an age that's unfamiliar to your reader are those that have to do with the material reality, the kind of the lived reality of the world. Some of the best creative writing advice I ever received from a teacher was just 4 words. He said, "Your best friends in writing fiction are left and right, hot and cold." This idea that, you know, if you say a character picks up a glass that's all right, that's an action. But if he picks up a cold glass, if the glass is cold to his touch, all of a sudden you're communicating something to the reader. They start forgetting the words in that way. They start feeling it. So kind of textures and weights and temperatures are brilliant tools for kind of inhabitation, I guess. I'm just going to read the very beginning of The Luminary, so hopefully it won't need any introduction. The beginning of this book took by far the longest to write. This first sentence took me 6 months, so it wasn't a very good hourly wage. I quite often find that with a project, that it kind of gains its own momentum as it goes along. Once it kind of acquires its own urgency and its own voice, I suppose, it starts giving me so much more to work with, but the first sentence is always very torturous. So this first chapter is called Mercury in Sagittarius, and it's preceded by a little summary, which I'll read. Mercury in Sagittarius, in which a stranger arrives in Hokitika, a secret council is disturbed, Walter Moody conceals his most recent memory, and Thomas Balfour begins to tell a story. The 12 men congregated in the smoking room of the Crown Hotel gave the impression of a party accidentally met. From the variety of their comportment and dress, frock coats, tailcoats, Norfolk jackets with buttons of horn, yellow moleskin, cambric and twill, they might have been 12 strangers on a railway car, each bound for a separate quarter of a city that possessed fog and tides enough to divide them. Indeed, the studied isolation of each man as he pored over his paper, or leaned forward to tap his ashes into the grate, or placed the splay of his hand upon the baize to take his shot at billiards, conspired to form the very type of bodily silence that occurs late in the evening on a public railway, deadened here not by the slur and clunk of the coaches, but by the fat clatter of the rain. Such was the perception of Mr. Walter Moody from where he stood in the doorway with his hand upon the frame. He was innocent of having disturbed any kind of private conference, for the speakers had ceased when they heard his tread in the passage. By the time he opened the door, each of the 12 men had resumed his occupation, rather haphazardly on the part of the billiard players, for they had forgotten their places, with such a careful show of absorption that no one even glanced up when he stepped into the room. The strictness and uniformity with which the men ignored him might have aroused Mr. Moody's interest had he been himself in body and temperament. As it was, he was queasy and disturbed. He had known the voyage to West Canterbury would be fatal at worst, an endless rolling trough of white water and spume that ended on the shattered graveyard of the Hokitika Bar, but he had not been prepared for the particular horrors of the journey, of which he was still incapable of speaking even to himself. Moody was by nature impatient of any deficiencies in his own person. Fear and illness both turned him inward, and it was for this reason that he very uncharacteristically failed to assess the tenor of the room he had just entered. Moody's natural expression was one of readiness and attention. His grey eyes were large and unblinking, and his supple, boyish mouth was usually poised in an expression of polite concern. His hair inclined to a tight curl. It had fallen in ringlets to his shoulders in his youth, but now he wore it close against his skull, parted on the side and combed flat with a sweet-smelling pomade that darkened its golden hue to an oily brown. His brow and cheeks were square, his nose straight, and his complexion smooth. He was not quite 28, still swift and exact in his motions, and possessed of the kind of roguish, unsullied vigour that conveys neither gullibility nor guile. He presented himself in the manner of a discreet and quick-minded butler, and as a consequence was often drawn into the confidence of the least voluble of men, or invited to broker relations between people he had only lately met. He had, in short, an appearance that betrayed very little about his own character, and an appearance that others were immediately inclined to trust. Moody was not unaware of the advantage his inscrutable grace afforded him. Like most excessively beautiful persons, he had studied his own reflection minutely, and in a way knew himself from the outside best. He was always in some chamber of his mind perceiving himself from the exterior. He had passed a great many hours in the alcove of his private dressing room, where the mirror tripled his image into profile, half profile, and square, Van Dyck's Charles, though a good deal more striking. It was a private practice, and one he would likely have denied, for how roundly self-examination is condemned by the moral prophets of our age, as if the self had no relation to the self, and one only looked in mirrors to have one's arrogance confirmed, as if the act of self-regarding was not as subtle, fraught, and ever-changing as any bond between twin souls. In his fascination, Moody sought less to praise his own beauty than to master it. Certainly whenever he caught his own reflection in a window box or in a pane of glass after nightfall, he felt a thrill of satisfaction, but as an engineer might feel, chancing upon a mechanism of his own devising and finding it splendid, flashing, properly oiled, and performing exactly as he had predicted it should. He could see his own self now, poised in the doorway of the smoking room, and he knew that the figure he cut was one of perfect composure. He was near trembling with fatigue. He was carrying a leaden weight of terror in his gut. He felt shadowed, even dogged. He was filled with dread. He surveyed the room with an air of polite detachment and respect. Thank you.
Do you want to talk a bit about the language and coming to the language? Or?
Yeah, well, I did a lot of poaching in kind of taking on the language of this book. A whole lot of things. I was delighted to discover, for example, that Emma Bovary washes her hands in lemon juice in order to bleach them. And I thought that was brilliant, so I kind of stole that and popped that into the book. I was also delighted to discover that Emma Bovary, at one point in the novel, drinks vinegar in order to lose weight, which I also really loved, but I'd already stolen the lemon juice, so I thought I'd better not steal the vinegar as well. Yes, I think that it's our values, how we express ourselves in the world is so codified in how we use language. And there are a great many ways of expressing oneself and ways of, in fact, describing one's impressions of the world that have fallen out of fashion, that were very much in vogue in the 19th century. I'm thinking in particular actually of the verb shall or should. This kind of hypothetical conditional that we don't really use anymore. This idea that's saying, shall you go and do this? Yes, I think I shall, or should you like this? There's this kind of dimension of the hypothetical that is preserved in the use of that verb, that where characters very often in 19th century novels are kind of having these conversations that are just delighting in the abstract nature of what it is that they're talking about. And going back there and for me kind of learning about those ways of expressing oneself that have fallen out of fashion for us now and trying to adopt them really taught me a lot about the values of the age, I think. I think that very often, another example that I can think of from today is that I spent a few years living in the United States when I was studying creative writing. And I was so astonished that in America, the brand name is used so much more than the actual name of the thing. So I would say, for example, if I was crying, I would say, do you have a tissue? Whereas in America, everyone would always say, do you have a Kleenex? It would, the brand has kind of become bigger than the object itself. And I think that if you examine those things, they do lead you to a value statement. I mean, there is a conclusion that you can draw there.
Yeah, thank you. We probably only have time for one question before I open it up, and it'll be about the work following on from this one. Because when I was writing my most recent novel, which ends in 1930, there was a point when I thought it would be so wonderful for the next novel to write something where if a person wants to communicate, I can just have them send an email and I know how it's done, and I don't have to sit down and think, right, a letter was sent from Peshawar to London, how long would it take to get there? And how long would it take, that there's, when you're working with the past, there's a lot of that sort of work you're doing, and it can feel like a relief to think, whether it actually happens in the next novel, but to think, with the next thing I'll write about stuff I know better. And I wonder for both of you, following on from these novels, whether, if you're willing to say, whether the next work will return you to the present, or whether you think sitting around in the past is something that you might want to do for a little longer.
Well, I can get my answer out of the way very quickly because I have no idea what I'm going to write next. So I very much doubt I'll return to the terrain of anything that's set in the past.
Really?
Yeah. Certainly.
Why?
Well, it was a big undertaking. You know, precisely for the reason that you've just raised, that you can't take anything for granted. So, you know, writing a novel is difficult and challenging enough as it is, without having to you know, sift through every historical detail to make sure it works and is authentic, and to deal with the language. I mean, I'm very glad I did. It was an enormously interesting undertaking, but it's not one that I would likely give myself to again.
Eleanor?
I think I'm almost exactly the opposite of that. I think that writing in the present is extraordinarily difficult, especially kind of since the invention of the internet. I think that there's something kind of so tacky about having your character check their Facebook feed and kind of tweet about their lunch or something. There's something that I would really struggle with, kind of, incorporating those brand names essentially into the fabric of a contemporary novel. I think that very often novelists who are writing in books set in the contemporary world will kind of curiously elide all of those things out of their characters' lives. So they, you know, I think very many fewer characters have cell phones that they are using all the time in fiction that they do in real life, for example. But also, like Damon, I have no idea what I'm going to write next, so it could be
Neither do I, so there we go. You have 3 writers in search of 3 novels. I'm going to turn over to the audience for questions. There's one gentleman with a red sleeve who raised his hand very enthusiastically. If you could just wait for a mic to be brought around to you. And could I ask that everyone ask rather succinct questions so we could have as many as possible?
Hello. So I'd imagine that the genre of historical fiction is challenging because you have to also keep to the accuracies of the worldview of the people that you write about. So my short question is, do you feel your modern stereotypes creeping into your works? And if so, how do you consciously try to avoid that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, I think. I think that the trick to it is to not use hindsight as a cheat's way out. You know, we know how history has panned out, and you know, we know who the victors are. We know, I mean, to a large extent, we do. And I think that when you use that as a shortcut to characterization, if you have very prescient characters, for example, who are predicting wars and predicting conflicts and predicting kind of cultural change in the world of your fiction, I think that that's something to be avoided at all costs. You have to remember that, like us right now, we have no idea how tomorrow and next week and next year is going to pan out in terms of world events, but also in terms of the events of our personal lives. And you kind of have to put the blinkers on in order to create that experience also for your characters, because if you use that hindsight, it's very tempting to use that hindsight, I think, because it enables you to create characters very, very swiftly, but in a very hollow way that I think is essentially unreal, and that your reader will always notice, I think.
Not a huge amount to add to that, just that stereotypes of any sort are to be avoided, really. I don't think human nature changes. History changes the externals, the costumes people wear, the vehicles they drive in, the ways they communicate, but the actual human nature is a constant. So I've worked with that as an assumption, basically.
Other questions, other hands up. There's another red sleeve belonging to a lady back there. We're going with the red sleeves. I promise I'll move to other colors.
This is related to the question that was asked just now. So the arrival of an outsider is a very common trope in 19th century novels, and The Luminaries begins with that as well. Does it take on a different significance in the genre of historical fiction, where the author is also, in a sense, an outsider to the past that they're writing about?
Yes, that's actually one of the things that I think that historical fiction has in common with fantasy and science fiction, or any kind of speculative fiction, that the assumption is always that your reader is not intimately familiar with this context. And a stranger is a very useful vehicle to come into this world, because the power relations, the kind of day-to-day life can be explained to the stranger, and therefore indirectly to the reader. So I think that, you know, certainly in constructing the luminaries, that was very much in my mind. I always thought that I would begin the novel with a stranger walking into a room. In fact, a man walking into a bar, as I discovered, is the way the book begins.
The gentleman in the front row.
Good afternoon, Professor. I know both of you are now established authors. Will you please share some of your experience during your first or second publication? Because I'm also an author and I'm facing some problems with the publishers. So during your first and second publication, some of your experience I would like to hear from you.
Was it comparatively easy, busy, the first publication, or was there the endless rejections and the endless doubt of whether anyone would ever publish you both? You were 17. How much doubt could there have been?
Yeah, well, at 17, you're full of doubt and also full of certainty.
Yeah.
I was lucky to be published at that age in one way, but I also look back on that book as something I wish I hadn't kicked off my career with now.
Yeah.
I won't let my publishers reissue it. A teacher at school took a manuscript, submitted it to a publisher, it got taken. It got taken because of my age, and that's not a good rule by which to operate as a writer. It gives you the impression that this is easy, and in fact it's only ever got more difficult for me. Perhaps Eleanor has a different, in fact she definitely has a different experience.
Well, again, I mean, I was very lucky in my path to become, for my first book being published. I had done a master's course in creative writing, and a publisher had actually read the manuscript in order to give a professional report on it as part of the way that the course was assessed. And so then he offered to publish it, and I enthusiastically said yes. But yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that, you know, actually the same teacher I mentioned before, the American writer Alan Gaganis, once talked of, when I was studying creative writing, talked of the very many students that he meets as a teacher who say, you know, I want to have 2 books out by the time I'm 30, I want to have this, that, and the other. They kind of have a plan for the speed of production. And his answer, I thought, was really brilliant. He said, oh, all right, 2 books by the time you're 30, that's fine, but which books? Which books do you really want to have written? Yeah. Because they probably won't be War and Peace. They probably won't be, you know, there's a large chance that if you're going in pursuit of something, you'll lose sight of the real project, which is to write the very best book that you can. And I think that once you have written the very best book that you can, the world kind of has a way of finding you, I guess. So I think that just to treat it like a kind of an apprenticeship, to apprentice yourself to the form of writing, to the craft of writing, and stick at it. Publication will come, but it's not the end. It's not the end result. It's really just the beginning of the next chapter.
I think, Willie, next time in Jaipur, you should have a session of panelists who wish they hadn't published their first novel. I think it could be an entertaining thing. I'm paying too much attention to the front of the garden. Are there questions at the back? There's one white-sleeved hand raised enthusiastically back there. Thank you.
Hi. My question is for all 3 of you. In historical fiction, what is easier to write? You pick up insignificant time in history and fill it up with your imagination, or you pick up a historic moment and, you know, about which you have information, you have research material, and you just have to put in little inputs.
That's a good one.
Well, I think for me it would be the first one. I think that having expecting that the reader knows very little about your subject matter, I believe is easier than knowing that your reader has certain assumptions and then having to kind of unburden them of those assumptions in some way. So I felt very free actually in writing about New Zealand in the 19th century because you know, when we think 19th century, we think of the world events that happened elsewhere in the world, and most people aren't, I mean, most people aren't thinking about what happened in New Zealand at that time. Most people didn't even know, for example, that New Zealand had gold rushes, and you know, that's of course that's normal, that's ordinary. But I felt quite free with having a comparative blank slate in terms of the reader's expectations.
I guess I'm the other version. I was dealing with established figures, and I wanted to be very true to those figures and to what I knew happened. But you're very wrong if you think it's just little inputs that have to buoy that up. You have to give body and soul to what is actually just a kind of skeleton of facts. You have to build up the tissue, as it were. And the novelistic imagination has to work very hard.
Yeah. The novel lives and dies in the details, doesn't it? I will say one thing, which is my most recent novel, A God in Every Stone, is set partly during the First World War and partly in 1930 Peshawar. And they're both historically significant, but the latter is largely forgotten. And it was in writing it, I realized that with the First World War, I could just assume so much knowledge on the part of the readers. Whereas with 1930, I couldn't, even people in Pakistan don't know what happened on the 22nd of April 1930 in Peshawar. So there's a slightly different sense, but it doesn't make one easier or more difficult. Other questions around the back? No, you're not very questioning people around the back. It's the eager early comers who have all the questions and got the front seats. The lady here who's just stood up with a very beautiful colored scarf around her neck.
Hi. My question is more towards Kamila because...
Okay. I'm just the moderator on this one.
Yeah, but maybe the others can comment.
Okay,
it's
try and find a way.
about
Yes.
writing historical question and this whole idea of language because it's deeply coded with everything.
Yeah.
And then you're writing in English about a continent that didn't speak English as universally at the time, but the audience now speaks English. And we've seen this with different people. Kiran Nagarkar would write it as if it's somebody writing for today. So what happens then? How do you then use language in a way that makes sense?
It's a good question. It's a complicated one, particularly because with A God in Every Stone, some people are speaking English and it's represented in English, and some are speaking Hindko and some are speaking Pashto. And actually the only way I could do it was to, in some way, sort of flatten all the language so that you're not really feeling, oh, now we're in English, now we have to use some Urdu phraseology. And it became more in the kinds of things they were saying rather than in the style of dialogue that their differences were coming through. Other questions? The lady in the second row who's raised her hand carrying a biro. This is the last question.
I just wanted to know, Eleanor, why you summarized each chapter at the beginning.
That was just it was a kind of a feature of 19th century novels that I really adored and wanted to have fun experimenting with. I think it also, it's a different kind of writing actually also, isn't it? It's the, you know, to summarize the events in a way that doesn't give anything away. Perhaps now that I'm thinking about it, I might have been slightly influenced by watching long-form TV shows, which has been a big part of my kind of shaping my narrative imagination over the last few years. That will begin with a kind of, you know, previously on this episode, next on this episode. So perhaps there was an influence there, but really it was just a way of picking up one of the tropes of the 19th century novel and having some fun with it.
Well, thank you all. We've come to the end of the session. And I think I'm possibly speaking on behalf of all of us when I say that really there's such a pleasure always in speaking in this lawn at Jaipur to look out into this number of people who all listen in silence for a whole hour. Thank you very much, all of you, and thank you, Damon, Galgut, and Eleanor, Catton.